and gentlemen, how are we all doing today? Hey, fantastic, good to hear. Okay, so today is the first part of 3 lectures that I will be doing about the building of the Panama Canal. So I've split this into 3 distinct parts, and the first part I want to talk about today is the French attempt at building the canal. And so to start, we need to go all the way back to 1870, to the Crystal Palace in London. And this place was filled with 40,000 people who were eagerly awaiting to see the man of the hour, all the way over from France, a man by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps. Lesseps, he had just completed the Suez Canal, a 105-mile long canal which now cut the distance between Europe and India by about 6,000 miles. It was incredible. In one stroke, he had managed to turn Africa into an island. And this was the time of progress. There was unlimited possibilities. The same year, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed by the Union Pacific. And this meant that now people in the United States could travel all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast by train. A few years earlier as well, they had laid down these cables, these telegraph cables, which now meant that Europe and the Americas were able to communicate rapidly. And this was a time in which the world was becoming a much smaller place, and these new technologies were opening up endless possibilities. Now, at the same time in which Lesseps is giving his grand talk at the Crystal Palace, a certain man comes back from a strange land known as Panama. This man here, Thomas Oliver Selfridge, he returns in 1870, and he's been sent on a mission by the Americans to survey the land and see about the possibility of building a canal. Now, Selfridge is not the first person to ever cross the isthmus. In fact, the Spanish had managed to do this as early as 1513, this conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He had managed to cross the isthmus, and as soon as he had crossed the isthmus, the Spaniards, they were interested in the possibilities that this could open up. They dreamt of a day in which they could connect the 2 seas and part the land. Of course, under the Spanish, the technology was never going to be available, but even the Spaniards understood that this kind of task could be done at some point in the distant future. As one priest put it, there are mountains and there are hands. If you had enough people to try and build this thing, it could happen. And throughout the years, people were interested in establishing routes across the isthmus. The Scottish had a rather disastrous attempt around 1700 at trying to establish a land route. You can see here in the Darien, New Edinburgh. What they were doing, and what the Bank of Scotland had poured all of their money into, was trying to make some money by crossing this isthmus. But it's not a very easy place to cross, and so this venture failed very quickly. The first people to eventually establish some kind of overland route successfully would be the Americans in 1855 with the Panama Railroad. This was an incredible achievement, and it now meant that the journey from New York to San Francisco had been reduced from 13,000 down to just 5,000 miles. It took 5 years and $8 million to construct. This was 3 years longer than expected and 6 times the initial proposed cost. But nobody seemed to care because they were turning so much of a profit, $7 million in the first 6 years. At one point, it was the highest valued stock on the New York Stock Exchange. And so people get this idea, if they can make so much money from a railroad, imagine a canal. They're not listening to all these voices crying out, though, about the horrendous conditions in Panama. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people had died to construct this railroad. Many of these people, though, were undocumented migrants coming from places like China and Ireland. In fact, there were so many of these undocumented migrants dying that the Panama Railroad had quite a good side hustle of selling cadavers to medical institutions. They'd managed to make enough money to build an entire hospital at Colón. And so people are dreaming of this idea of a canal, but it just doesn't seem possible yet. Not until a man in 1854, Dr. Edward Cullen, he comes back from Darien and he says, you know what guys, this is really, really blown out of proportion. I've crossed the isthmus and it's easy. Absolute piece of cake. In fact, those mountains and hills you're talking about, nothing more than 150 feet. And everybody's very excited. If there's now an easy route across the isthmus, there's the possibility of a canal, and so an international community comes together to plan an expedition. It's going to be a combined effort between the English, the French, the Colombians, and the United States. They go to the isthmus to try and copy this route. The first to arrive there is the American Army Lieutenant Isaac Strain. And Strain, he doesn't want to wait for the rest of the people from England and France. He decides to go off by himself with his 27 men into the jungle. And he manages to cross to the other side, but he loses 7 of his men along the way. He himself gets incredibly ill and never quite recovers from his illness. He dies just a few years later at the young age of 36. It was a pipe dream, it was a lie. There was no easy route crossing the isthmus. If they were going to do this task, it was going to be a massive challenge. But a challenge that people saw as worthwhile, especially the President Ulysses S. Grant. As he put it, to Europeans the benefits of a proposed canal are great. To Americans they are incalculable. And so it was he who decided to send Selfridge to go on this mission to try and see a possibility of building a canal. But if we fast forward 5 years, the Americans have given up on this idea of building a canal at Panama. Instead, they think a much greater idea is to go through Nicaragua because of this huge lake that they have that will make the transit a lot easier. However, that man who has built the Suez Canal, Ferdinand de Lesseps, he's getting ready to make a big announcement at a convention which has been organised by the Geographic Society in Paris. And his announcement is that he's going to do it all again. This time, not a canal in Suez, but a canal in Panama. It will be done in the same way, a sea-level canal, which will finally connect the Pacific to the Atlantic. Now, who is this man who's come up with this grand idea of creating the Panama Canal? Well, it's Ferdinand de Lesseps. The man was born in Versailles to a family of French diplomats. And although they had quite nice status, his father had lost much of his fortunes when Ferdinand was just a boy. But he followed in the footsteps of his family and he became a diplomat himself, going to Egypt. And in Egypt, he heard this story of an ancient Suez Canal, which had been investigated by Napoleon Bonaparte and his men. And so he gets interested in this idea of what would it mean if you could connect the Mediterranean and get all the way to Asia much quicker. Now, eventually he's moved away from Egypt. He's sent on this diplomatic mission in which he has to return the Pope to the Vatican. All kinds of political mess is going on at the moment, including the French changing government. And so Ferdinand, he's sent to do one mission, and while he's doing it, the government changes, and it's an absolute disaster, and so they decide they're going to blame everything on Ferdinand and use him as the scapegoat. He is disgraced as a diplomat, and so he goes and lives off in the countryside. This isn't an easy time for Ferdinand, though. He loses both his wife and his son to disease, and he's looking for some way to occupy his time. He gets in touch with an old friend, this man here, Mohammed Said Pasha, the leader of Egypt, and he's talking to this man about the possibility of building a canal, the Suez canal in Egypt. And so Lesseps, he decides to go and try and raise some funds. He has no political backing, and in fact, many people are working against him. The Prime Minister of Great Britain is saying that he's a swindler, just looking to take people's money. But Lesseps is very successful. He manages to get people on his side, the ordinary French people, and so 25,000 small investors end up supporting the project. The other half of the project is supported by his friend, Said Pasha. Now, after Said's death, Lesseps is very lucky that his successor is keen to build a canal, and his successor almost goes completely bankrupting Egypt, trying to complete this project, but finally, in 1869, it is complete. And Lesseps, he is celebrated, very much celebrated in France. He's known as Le Grand Français, the great Frenchman, and it's not just in France where he's celebrated. He's given this, which is the Grand Cross of the Star of India, one of the highest honours you can be given by the British at the time. People build statues to him. And he also earns a reputation being known as the Great Engineer. The thing about Ferdinand de Lesseps, though, is he is not an engineer. His skills lie elsewhere. He is very personable, very good at getting people to agree with him and inspire men. He is fantastic with propaganda, and he has an undying optimism. But he's not an engineer. In fact, it's not even Ferdinand de Lesseps who starts this whole idea of a Panama Canal. He's not running it at first. It's actually this man here, Istvan Tur, who was a revolutionary turned canal enthusiast. And he leads a society who wants to build this canal, and they wheel out Ferdinand de Lesseps to make the announcement, given all of the good grace and popularity of Ferdinand at the time. And so this society here, the Société Civile Internationale, the Canal Interoceanique, which I will just be referring to as the Tur Syndicate, go and they try and find a way to build the canal. They send this man here, Lucien Napoleon Bonaparte Weiss. He is a distant descendant of the Napoleon Bonaparte, and he goes to Panama to try and find a route. It goes horrendously. He has 17 men go on a 6-month journey, and 2 of them end up dying. Weiss himself gets extremely ill, and he's entirely discouraged by the project as a whole. He can find no way of building a sea-level canal that these French people want, and so he goes back and he suggests maybe if they considered building a tunnel, it could be possible, but otherwise, it's not going to happen. They don't like this answer, and so they send Weiss again to try and find a proper route. He goes into the Panamanian jungle and he gets ill again. And so he goes back to Panama City and decides there's a better way for him to spend his time. He ends up going to Bogota. Now, at the time, Panama is part of the United States of Colombia. These are 9 autonomous states that have their own governors but are unified under this name of the United States of Colombia. So he goes and speaks with the Colombian government about the possibility of getting the rights to build a canal. And he's very successful. He gets something known as the peace concession, which says that Colombia will receive 5 to 8% of this canal revenue, with a minimum payment of $250,000 a year. The company would receive 500,000 hectares of public land, plus 200 meters either side of the canal. The canal would remain neutral, and after 99 years, control would revert to Colombia. Very importantly, for when I talk about the American involvement, the agreement says that the rights could be sold to another company, but never to a foreign government. And so this is fantastic news. It's a great success for the Tur Syndicate and this idea of building a canal in Panama. But there's some very important things that they need to sort out. Firstly, they don't have any maps and surveys, or they have very few. Weiss had been sent there to survey the area, and he hadn't done that. And so on his way back to France, he stops off in the United States and he asks if they wouldn't mind selling those maps to him. The US very politely decline, and so they're going to have to find a way to do this themselves. The second big problem is, how are they going to build this canal? It's clear that at the moment everybody wants a sea level canal like there is at Suez. It seems to be much simpler, much grander. You're not going to waste time with ideas such as locks. But is it even going to be possible? And then lastly is the question of the railroad. If you're going to build this grand canal, then you're going to have to buy that railroad from the Americans, and that hadn't been organised yet. And so, as a way to try and figure out all of these problems, a congress is held in Paris in 1879. And they try and decide what they should do about building a canal. You have delegates from 22 different countries coming together and talking about their ideas. It's very clear that the main idea is to build a sea level canal at Panama. The Americans that are there are very quiet. They're sitting on their idea of building a canal in Nicaragua, and so they don't pipe up, they stay quiet. In fact, the only man to really propose any kind of alternative is this man here, Adolphe de Lesseps. And Lesseps comes up with a different idea. He's the only engineer present who has worked in a tropical climate. And he suggests the best idea is to build a lock canal. The Chagres River, which is going to be a monumental obstacle in the way, should be dammed into locations to make a huge man-made lake, which is eventually what ends up happening, but nobody wants to listen to Lesseps at the time, despite the fact that his idea is only going to take 6 years, and it's only going to cost 500 million francs, in comparison to what the French presume at the time a sea level canal will take, which is 12 years and 1 billion francs. But the man of the hour is Ferdinand de Lesseps. And if Ferdinand de Lesseps says that he wants a sea level canal, well, a sea level canal is what they shall build. And so this is his grand idea. And at this point, Lesseps decides that he is going to take over from the Turf syndicate. He ends up buying them out for 10 million francs, and he organises a syndicate of his own with his friends. He then tries to raise the money for 100 million francs, but only manages to sell a fraction of the shares. But he's forever the optimist. He decides that now he's going to go to Panama himself. He's never been, but he's certain that if he goes, he can figure out a way to get this project done. And so he travels in 1879 and he tours the Panama Railroad. He's talking with all of these people who've worked on the railroad, asking about what they think about the possibility of building a canal. All of these people tell him he's going to have two big issues. The first issue is going to be labour. The Panamanians, they don't really like doing manual labour. Those wealthy Panamanians are too dignified to dig, and so they're going to have to import labour from elsewhere. The second thing the men of the railway tell him is that everything's going to have to be imported. Absolutely everything. Nothing's being made in Panama. Every shovel, every tent, every mattress, every piece of paper needed to build this canal is going to have to be shipped from elsewhere. It was going to be a massive undertaking, but Lesseps, he wasn't fazed. He believed they could do it. And so he goes again to try and sell these shares, and he manages to encourage the people of France and taps into their sense of national pride, and he manages to raise that initial capital of 300 million francs. That's about 60 million US dollars. It's nowhere near enough money you're going to need to build a canal. But he sells these shares at 500 francs a share. Now, the reason this is more successful this time is because 500 francs a share is about the average salary a year of your typical French family. And they can pay in 6 installments. And so loads of people end up buying these shares. In fact, it's oversubscribed. You have 1.2 million people trying to buy these shares. And you can see here, 80,000 people only owned 1 to 5 shares. This is small investments, just your average French family, and it was one of the most subscribed stocks by women at the time. Just average French people wanted to hold on to this stock, and there was good reason for that, because the Suez Canal at the time was at 2,000 francs a share, so there was an opportunity to make a lot of money here. They believed that building this canal was going to be rather simple. Lesseps believed that the answer was just to build it exactly as he had done at Suez, a sea level canal going through the land. But as you can see here, Suez is very dry and very flat, not like Panama. Panama is hot and humid and it rains a lot. You have 10 feet of rain a year on the Caribbean slope and 5 to 6 feet in Panama City. And when the rain came down, it came down hard and it came down fast. There were also all of the hills to deal with. It wasn't just 150 feet above sea level as had been suggested in the past. The highest was 330 feet above sea level. And all of this is dense jungle. They have to deal with the Chagres River. This planned route of the canal has the Chagres River winding through it about 14 times. They have no idea what they're going to do about that at the time. But they begin the work anyway. In January of 1881, the first group of engineers arrived in Colón. And February the 1st, the message comes in. Travail commence. Work has begun. Now, the man who had been sent by Ferdinand de Lesseps to organise this was Armand Reclus. He was in charge of essentially organising all of the different moving parts at the time. But most of the work and most of the planning would actually be done by a man called Blanchot. Gaston G. Blanchot, he was the leader or the person who had been sent by this company, Couvreau and Versant. This had been a construction company in which they had been trusted to build the Suez Canal, and now they were being trusted again to build in Panama. And so the first task at hand is they decide that what they're going to need to do is, along this 50-mile line, is cut away all of the jungle. And they do that by hand. They use black and indigenous labourers to go into the jungle with nothing but machetes and axes and hack away at the jungle. Once it's finally been cleared, they have to essentially build brand new towns. Colón is now seeing a surge of activity, and they end up importing 50 prefabricated homes from New Orleans and setting them up at new places like Gatun and Emperador. And so you have these barracks that you have here up on stilts, which are very practical, concrete floors and treated wood, and these are to house the black workers that were coming over. And then here you have the cottages made for the predominantly white French engineers, and they were very practical, quite simple for the time. They had these verandas and hammocks, but none of this was easy at all. Like I said, the climate in Panama was horrendous for trying to do anything. Everything was wet all of the time, and the humidity meant that if they ever brought any furniture over, the glue just dissolved. Everything was rusting. One traveller would describe this place as hell upon earth. The next issue that they had to solve was buying the canal, buying the railroad from the Americans, and they do so for $20 million. Now, I told you that initial funding that they got was $60 million, and so Ferdinand de Lesseps has just spent 1/3 of all of the resources on buying the railroad, because what else is he going to do? The Americans have stated that price, and if he doesn't buy it, he's not getting his canal. So he massively overpays for a railroad which is falling apart. And then what makes it more complicated is, even though it's now owned by the French technically, it's still an American registered company, ran by Americans, and when they agreed to build this railroad, they signed something called the Bidlack Treaty. Now, in 1846, they signed this, and this is the reason the Americans were allowed to even construct in the first place, and it guarantees US transit rights across the isthmus in exchange for protecting sovereignty and providing defense. Essentially, this meant that the United States had to send their navy and have somewhat of a military presence in the area in order to not only protect the railroad, but the sovereignty of Panama and Colombia. And so the next thing to do was to get all of those maps that they were missing. Now, Blanchot, he did this himself. He went out into the jungle with a group of surveyors, and these men were wild, shooting alligators and swatting away all of these scorpions. He did a fantastic job. In fact, these maps that are produced at the time were an invaluable asset to the Americans when they finally take over. The issue in the jungle, though, and what becomes a massive issue for Blanchot, is not the scorpions and the alligators, but the mosquitoes. Because in June of 1881, there's the first case of yellow fever. At the time, they had about 800 labourers working on the canal. In that first year, officially, 60 of them died from disease. Now, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't actually yellow fever that was the main killer in Panama. It was, in fact, malaria. But the difference between the two was that to witness yellow fever was absolutely horrendous. It's what would play on people's minds the most. It was the yellowing of the skin, and then the vomiting and coughing up blood. To witness someone dying from yellow fever was horrendous. If you survived, you got immunity, unlike malaria, which was the main killer, in which you could get hit with that over and over again. Now, the French did come up with some ideas of dealing with the malaria. They started to use this stuff called quinine. Now, quinine had been discovered all the way back by the indigenous people of Peru. It is a bark which helps with the symptoms of malaria. And so this helps to dispel much of the fear of malaria over something like yellow fever. And the French, they start giving people this. They are taking this very seriously. They don't want everybody dying from disease. They even end up, in typical French fashion, mixing this quinine with wine to help make the taste a bit more palatable. And so they're really working hard to make sure that people aren't getting ill. In fact, they invest huge amounts of money into these hospitals. $5.6 million are spent on this hospital in Panama City at Acorn Hill, another $1 million in Colón, and then $500,000 at Taboga. And despite there being people criticizing how the French are handling it, one doctor from Canada would say that the finest and most perfect system of hospitals ever made within the tropics would be made by the French. The issue is not that they are negligent or don't see the importance of trying to tackle things like yellow fever and malaria. The issue is just that the science isn't there yet. People still believe in something called miasma theory. This is the idea that it's bad smells that are causing all of this disease. That decomposing corpses and trash in the streets, that is what is making people ill, and that's something that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. These witch doctors in their beaks, it would be filled with lavender and perfumes to filter out those bad smells. People still believed in this. As early as 1848, you had these two men here who were suggesting that perhaps there was some connection between insects and mosquitoes with yellow fever and malaria, but nobody was listening to them yet. The idea hadn't quite taken hold. And so, ironically, the work of the French actually made the situation worse. In the hospital at Acorn Hill, they had a lot of ants. And so what do? To keep all of those ants away is they fill dishes with water and they put all the bedposts in these dishes of water. Now, a perfect artificial container filled with clean water, the mosquitoes were loving it. The disease remained a threat throughout the entire time, and they never tackled it before construction started. Construction finally begins excavation begins January the 20th of 1882. And it goes pretty well. They're quite good at this excavation. They're faster than expected, and that's thanks to all of these new technologies that are coming out at the time. You have the steam shovel, which is invented in the 1840s in England and then eventually perfected by the 1880s. And essentially, it's just a big shovel that you can put on tracks to move huge amounts of earth. You then also have these colossal machines like the bucket excavator, which is, well, exactly how it looks. You have this chain of buckets constantly taking out all of this material. And something similar to do in the water, these dredges which pull up material and then fire it away using water to somewhere where it can be filled. And so, work is rather quick. Things seem to be going well. The problem is, there's a huge amount of machinery, and they're starting to bring in different contractors. They're subcontracting, and then those subcontractors subcontract, and everything's getting really complicated, and the person in charge of organising all of this eventually ends up resigning. Armand Reclus. So Armand Reclus resigns. He can't deal with all of this administration, and just to make the situation worse in Panama, shortly after he resigns, an earthquake hits Panama. It's the worst that has ever been seen, and it destroys much of Panama City. This was a hotel which was being used by the company as a headquarters, and it was badly damaged by this earthquake. Luckily though, Ferdinand de Lesseps back in France, he assured everybody that it was okay. He told everyone there will be no more earthquakes in Panama, and he assured everyone that this would be true. Everything seemed to work. The investors, they maintained their confidence, and the French press continued to back him. But behind the scenes, things were going wrong. That huge contractor that had built the Suez Canal resigns. They say that the reason is because there were all of these small subcontractors being used, and they were just taking up resources. It was in the interest of the French people for them to resign. In reality, they could see that the writing was on the wall. There was no way they were going to build a sea-level canal in the time and with the resources that had been allocated. And so later the company admits to lying about their reasons for withdrawing in order to try and avoid damaging the reputation of the canal company. In order to fix all of this mess, the resignation, the earthquake, and then the major contractor pulling out, was this man here, Jules Dingler. He arrived on March the 1st of 1883, and he was the one who was going to try and fix everything. Now, believe it or not, the French did not have any plan at this point on how they were going to build the canal. Dingler was the first and only Frenchman to ever come up with a master plan of how to build a canal. Two of the main things in this new plan was to build a huge dam at Gamboa. And he also said that he wanted to increase the slope of the canal, which would mean digging up 60% more dirt. Now, despite this, Ferdinand de Lesseps, he stuck to his guns. He said there's going to be no increase to the time it's going to take and no increase to the amount of money we're going to need to build this canal. Everything will be okay. That year, the workforce increased to 13,000. Huge amounts of people were coming over from the West Indies, especially from Jamaica. And these people coming over from Jamaica and other places in the West Indies were paid relatively well for the time, somewhere between $1 and $1.50 a day. They were paid by the bucket, which meant that once they reached their quota, they could work more or less as they pleased. The issue was, though, that while these wages were rather good, many of them wouldn't see those wages. By this point, yellow fever was now killing 20% of new arrivals. Only 20% of those survivors were fit to continue working. Jules Dinger wasn't spared from this horrendous disease either. In January of 1884, his daughter died of yellow fever. Shortly later, he lost both his son and his son-in-law. If that wasn't horrendous enough, by New Year's Eve of the same year, Dingler's wife caught yellow fever and passed away. Of course, this caused a huge amount of stress for Dingler, and he would eventually resign, leaving behind all of his family buried in Panama. One of the last things he witnessed, though, was a monumental event in the history of the construction of the Panama Canal, and that was the Preston Uprising in March of 1885. The same month in which he resigns, there was a huge crisis in Panama. In 1884, this man here, Rafael Núñez, he had been elected to the presidency, and he had a different way of thinking. Colombia was, as I said, these United States, and he wanted to centrify or make all of the power central in Bogota instead, basically taking away the power of these states, which caused the states to revolt. Many of these revolts meant that troops were taken away from Panama, which left it open to revolt itself. And so this man here, Rafael Aizpuru, he goes and he takes Panama City. Those who are loyal to Colombia, they travel from Colón down to Panama City to try and put down this uprising, which leaves open Colón to even more rebels. A man named Preston, he manages to take the entire city with nothing but a few machetes and a couple of pistols. Now, what's really interesting at the time is that Ibla Treaty, in which the US are obliged to protect the sovereignty of Colombia and protect the railroad. And so, there's a massive US gunboat sitting just off the shore of Colón, the USS Galena. And everybody is wondering, what is this good ship going to do? They didn't know that at the time they had only been given orders to do anything if railway property was under threat. But then Preston tries to move a shipment of guns into Colón and the US stop him. Now this angers Preston and he ends up taking a hostage, and so the Americans, with the help of the Colombians, go in and manage to take back Colón, not after those rebels set the whole place on fire. Now, shortly after, they manage to resolve the situation. The Americans move in, both in Panama City and at Colón, and peace is restored. But this whole situation has been a very interesting lesson, especially for these three men who will come up later in my story. We have Amador Guerrero, who will become the first president of an independent Panama. We also have this man here, an American, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He had been one of the Marines to land in Panama City, and he would later become one of the most influential historians of that century, talking about the influence of the Navy and things like gunboats in diplomatic affairs. And then we have this man here, Felipe Buno Varela. If anybody knows the story of the Panama Canal already, you will know a lot about this man. He is going to become my protagonist later on in my next presentation. He is an extremely interesting man. Felipe Buno Varela is a French engineer. He has come over to Panama at the age of 26, a young age, and he wants to do service for his country. He is a staunch nationalist. This is a time at which everybody knows what is going on in Panama. Everybody seems to be dying of yellow fever. And so the faculty members at the top engineering colleges in France are saying, don't go. Don't go. It's a suicide mission. There's no way you're going to be able to complete this canal. It's not worth it. Felipe Buno Varela, though, he has a very different idea. He says that these dangers, this dying, would only exalt the energy of those who are filled with a sincere love for the great task undertaken. To its irradiating influence was joined the heroic joy of self-sacrifice for the greatness of France. These men were soldiers going in on the front line against yellow fever. While these men were dropping like flies, Ferdinand de Lesseps had just been introduced into the Académie Française, the 40 Immortals, one of the highest offers you can, or one of the highest levels of prestige you can achieve in France. Despite this great public image and being recognised by the people in his country, things were starting to show their cracks. By 1885, there are a number of newspaper articles that were attacking the Panama Canal. One American journalist said it was a gigantic wildcat speculation, and another in Britain suggested that there was corruption at hand, that the canal company were paying off the newspapers to try and support Lesseps. And Ferdinand de Lesseps himself, he realises they're in a bit of a sticky situation. They've just had a storm hit Cologne, and much of their infrastructure has been damaged, and he's realising he needs more money. He's quickly run out, and so he goes to the French government and he asks for permission to release these lottery bonds. Now, lottery bonds are like regular bonds, except you can receive some nice prizes, but they're heavily regulated by the French government, hence needing to get permission. And the French government, they look at this situation and they say, yes, we will consider releasing these lottery bonds, but first we're going to send this man here. Armand Rousseau is going to check and see if everything in Panama is in order. And only based on his report will we make that decision. And so Rousseau goes to Panama and he carries out his inspection, and he's shortly followed by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who travels to Panama for a second time, aged 18. In 1886, he makes tours of the area where they are planning on building the canal, and he gives these great speeches and has these great banquets, and the confidence in the canal has been restored. He also travels over with a new man to carry out and sort out the problems of the Panama Canal. The new person to lead the project will be Leon Boyer. He's taking over from Bruno Varilla, who has managed to find himself as caretaker manager of the entire project. Now, people are very tense, and eventually the report comes back from Rousseau on what's going on in Panama. Now, things seem to be a disaster, but this report is actually quite favourable to Lesseps. It says that to abandon the project would be unthinkable, not only for shareholders, but for French prestige. And he suggests that the French government offer moral assistance, such as supporting Lesseps with releasing those lottery bonds. He does also say that some major changes need to be made, especially with the idea on how they are going to go about building this canal. What he is alluding to is the fact that this obsession with building a sea-level canal instead of a lock canal is going to destroy the entire project. And he's not the only person who is saying this at the time. The engineer who had gone over with Lesseps, Leon Boyer, he writes a letter back to Ferdinand de Lesseps saying that he and all of his engineers have concluded that a sea-level canal is just not going to work. He puts forward his arguments, sends off the letter, and before the letter even arrives, he dies from malaria. The situation in Panama is not good. And it's fueled by this obsession of building a canal this way. Lesseps, he is stubborn. The French government have said that yes, they will release these lottery bonds to Ferdinand de Lesseps, but only if he agrees to an audit of the company. And Lesseps, he can't stand that. He is stubborn. He says, no way, we are not going to agree to that. They are in major financial trouble at this point. They have $15 million, and they're paying $15 million on annual interest on their borrowing. And they're talking about the possibility of bankruptcy. People start to float some rumours that Lesseps is terminally ill and not doing so well. To fight those rumours, Lesseps says that he's as well as ever. He decides to go over to New York, where a new project, a gift from the French people, is being unveiled for the Americans, the Statue of Liberty. And he's as full of life as ever. And he gives another of his great speeches to the people. And he ends it by saying, soon, gentlemen, we shall meet again to celebrate a peaceful conquest. Goodbye until we meet in Panama. After travelling back to France, Ferdinand de Lesseps would never cross the Atlantic again. His obsession with this canal, the dream of a sea-level canal, every day that they continued with it was wasted money. And eventually, finally, by October of 1887, after numerous engineers and another report comes out, he finally agreed that he was going to build a lock canal. But maybe it was too little, too late. He said that if he was going to have a lock canal, then it was going to be the greatest lock canal that the world has ever seen, and he decides to bring on some prestige. He goes and he tries to convince a certain someone to agree to build those locks. That man being perhaps the most famous at the time in France, Gustave Eiffel. And Gustave Eiffel's most current project looks like this at the moment. And he agrees. He comes on board and he says that he will build these locks in Panama for Ferdinand de Lesseps. It could be too late though. They're very quickly running out of money. And so Lesseps, he begs the French government to release those lottery bonds, and they eventually agree. He tries to sell them, but he can't sell them all. He needs to sell 400,000 bonds in November of 1887 for the project to survive. And so he goes on a tour of all of France. He goes to 26 different cities, he and his son Charles de Lesseps. And he's trying to convince people to buy these bonds. He makes his appeal to the French people. He says, I appeal to all Frenchmen. I appeal to all my colleagues' fortunes that are threatened. Your fates are in your own hands. Decide. He really needs people to buy these bonds. And November 29th comes around and news starts to pour in. People have started to gather around his office. They want to hear what's happened. Have they sold all of these bonds or not? People are anxiously waiting, and finally at 4 p.m. Ferdinand de Lesseps comes out of his office. And he stands on the table and he gives another one of his great speeches. He says, my friends, the subscriptions are safe. Our advisories are confounded. We have no need for help of financiers. You have saved yourself by your own exertion. The canal is made, and everybody cheers and parties on into the night. Finally, they have managed to save the canal. Apparently, those 400,000 bonds they needed to sell, they managed to do that in Paris alone. Everybody rejoices. And they're still partying on the next day. They go to the office where he had made that great speech, and they want to see Ferdinand de Lesseps. And they wait all afternoon, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait until eventually Lesseps comes out of his office. But it isn't Ferdinand de Lesseps, it's his son Charles. And he has some news. He says he's sorry that my father is younger in spirit than I. His remarks were made on the strength of a hopeful report I made to him. The result is bankruptcy, or the winding up of the company. They had only managed to sell 180 of the 400,000 shares. Ferdinand had got rather overexcited, believing in this false report. And he believed that the canal could be saved. He goes on, he tries to start a new canal company. He appeals to the French government, but it's over. And finally, on February the 4th of 1889, the canal company is dissolved. Now, some years later, it will come out a number of controversies. In 1892, it's revealed that over 100 French government officials and journalists had been bribed by the canal company. Part of the reason that everything seemed okay the whole time was because even the French Prime Minister at the time had been bribed by the canal company, including all of these journalists reporting that everything was just fine. Charles de Lesseps went on trial not only once but twice, and he's sentenced to 5 years in jail. Gustave Eiffel ends up going to jail as well. He serves a 2-year sentence for his involvement in the Panama scandal. Ferdinand himself, he manages to escape much of the scrutiny. He's in his old age now, and so he's allowed to be let off. He goes and he lives in the countryside, and his wife protects him from finding out anything that has really happened. It's kept a secret from him for as long as possible until finally she tells him that the reason his son is not coming for New Year's is because he is in prison. And so begins the decline of Ferdinand de Lesseps, and he eventually dies on December the 7th of 1894 at the age of 89. His funeral was modest, attended only by family and close friends. The Suez Canal company covered the funeral expenses, and the word Panama was never uttered. Some Americans later would theorize that Ferdinand de Lesseps had died in an insane asylum. For the French, he still remained this ancient and honourable hero who was somewhat flawed in judgment and lacking some common sense. Lesseps' downfall was in his downright refusal to listen to people, to all of his engineers, to everybody suggesting to him that he should read the reports and give up the idea of a sea-level canal. But he was stubborn. Despite all of these faults, though, Ferdinand de Lesseps inspired loyalty and affection in all those that he worked with. And his belief in the power of the new technologies that were coming out at the time. He was not an engineer himself, but he believed in humankind, in the ability to solve problems with mathematics. And his faith was perhaps misplaced. When everything came to an end, about $287 million had been spent on this project by the French. Trying to figure out how many people died is rather tricky because for every official report there was, it's estimated 2 or 3 additional people had died. But the best guess we can put is at between 20 and 22,000 in the time of the French. All of the equipment, all of the things that had been built was left behind to be reclaimed by the Panamanian jungle, and that could have been it. That could be the end of the story. This had been a lesson, a catastrophic failure, perhaps the worst failure of modern times of some infrastructure project. But maybe if it wasn't for one French engineer who was determined to get this canal built, we wouldn't have a Panama Canal. And so I'll be telling you all about him on my next presentation. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, come on.